Okay, so this morning we're looking at two areas around movement and motor development. So we'll start off by thinking about the kind of developmental aspects. So how do we develop our motor skills? What are the theories? What are the patterns of that? And then after the break, we're going to look at a series of motor control. Okay, so they're slightly different things. So one of them is sort of how do we develop, and the other one is how do we organise and structure our movement. And from learning about motor control, we can then start to understand motor learning, which is how do we then learn and develop new motor skills. And so theories about motor control and motor learning go across the lifespan. And when you work with adults with brain injury, we then talk about, or stroke, we then talk about motor relearning. So how do you relearn movement skills that have been lost or have been damaged by damage to the central nervous system? So the first part, we're going to look at development of motor skills. So hopefully, what I'll try and do today is introduce you to some of the kind of general concepts of the way we think about movement. And these will re-emerge later on in the degree, in the programme, in terms of trying to understand then how do you intervene when somebody has motor difficulties and motor deficits. So we'll look at different stages of movement development in children and think about motor development for occupational performance. And we'll look at a couple of theorists. So we're just Kelly and I were discussing one of the theories we're going to be talking about, and that his work's very old and very outdated, but what was quite surprising for me when I was revising all this again was how influential his work still is in terms of the way we think about motor development. So we now understand that motor development is a combination of these things. It's a combination of the maturation process, the kind of growth process, and maturation of the central nervous system. Yeah, so there's two separate things. We're growing, but our central nervous system is maturing and becoming more sophisticated as well. Some of this is influenced by your genetic background, your genetic makeup, okay? And some of it will be influenced by the environment. And it's that interaction between the environment and also the experiences that a child has that influences their motor development. And that's the modern thinking. So the old thinking was really that it was all about growth and maturation and genetics. And it was nothing to do with your experiences. And some of the early kind of physiologists and experiments talked about, there's one observation of a child who had to be in a full body cast from about the age of 6 months to the age of 18 months. So that completely restricted the child's movement. And when the child came out of the cast, they were able to walk, even though they hadn't had any of those experiences. So that kind of led to the idea that you will just develop your motor skills regardless of what happens to you. But we now understand that it's not as straightforward as that, and some things are different. So experiences are crucial to motor development as well, and the kinds of motor skills that we develop. So we're just really thinking about this is the kind of summary, we could have had this last week really as well. It's about the biological and physical changes that occur in human beings from birth to the end of adolescence, until the person is completely mature. I don't mean in the sense of, how well they behave, but actually until the growth period has stopped. And so we're thinking about physical development. It is an age and stage process. It is sequential, but some of the newer theories kind of view it as almost like it's stage-like, it's a phase-like process. But there's a lot of variability amongst children as to when they hit different stages and whether they skip certain types of movement out or not. And the whole premise really is around what we're trying to do. Ultimately, our motor skills are highly organised, voluntary action. So there's a difference between sort of the reflex actions of, when you put your hand on a hot plate or you tread on a pin, they're automatic, they don't have much conscious thought, you don't have much control over them, they're reflexive. Have you done reflexes, primitive reflexes in physiology? Not yet. So, there are different complexities, but your very basic reflex arc. So, it's the inputs, they're always associated with the stimulus. The input comes in, and you have this short circuit where actually sensory information comes in, it hits spine, and then a motor reaction goes out from the spine. So, some of those immediate reactions, the reason why you don't have any control over it is because it doesn't hit your brain first. The movement is initiated from the spine level of the spinal cord, and then you have information coming up to your brain, which then helps you, make more sense of it. It's a very simple description of a very basic reflex arc. There are more complex ones as well. We now know that movement is not just about those kind of reflexive automatic movements. They're highly skilled and highly organised and voluntary. And that seems very obvious, but that's, again, in the middle of the 20th century, that's not how people were thinking about movement. So normal development, it is relatively predictable, and there are lots of books and things that are available. There's a number of books, should be on the reading list, in the e-library, which just, all they do is take you through the milestones, motor milestones, communication milestones, and social milestones. And we use milestones a lot in terms of thinking about whether a child has a delay, either in their kind of learning, or it might be a motor skills delay if they kind of start to be diagnosed with things like developmental coordination disorder. So milestones can be quite important in terms of understanding the issues for a child. And we have this idea that there are kind of critical periods. We know that most motor development is occurring in the early years, and a lot after that, a lot of it is about refining and perfecting movement. And we have, patterns of movement. It's there's an increase in complexity. So it's not just about the complexity of the movement. There will be increasing accuracy of movement, increasing levels of control. We're moving from very kind of specific, general patterns of movement, which are kind of like sitting and rolling, to very specific patterns of movement that help us to do more complex tasks. And all of this is heavily influenced by growth. And the reason I've got these two pictures up here is that don't underestimate just the physics of body shape and size in young children. Okay? What's the key difference between these two children here, apart from their size? Think about proportions. Baby's got a big head. What's that going to make it hard to do? Balance, get up, sit. Is it any wonder you prop them up and they fall over? They've got massive heads on top of their body. Just think about gravity, base of support. It was interesting, a couple of years ago we were having our movement and handling updates, and the person doing it was an external person, and they were talking about, they showed a video of a small child bending down, reaching down to pick something up, and they were half squatting, and then they were, the way that they were moving. And she said, as an adult we lose that ability because we lose our flexibility. And the physio was furious. Because the physio said it's not just about flexibility. Look at the child's body proportions. It's much easier for a small child to be squatting and crouching on the ground than it is for an adult. It's much easier for them to bend their knees to pick something up than it is for an adult, because their legs are short, their centre of gravity is low. Yeah. So some of the stuff that we do and the changes in the way we move are purely a result of the change in kind of proportions in the physics. So what we find is that when they're little, remember this, right? You have a lot of kind of central development and head growth. So most of the growth seems to occur in their head and their trunk. And even watching my own children, the thing that caught me by surprise was how long it took them to be able to wipe their own bottoms, because their arms aren't long enough.
Yeah.
So they can't reach. Yeah. They put their arms above their head and their hands are like this, so they can't, because they haven't got that, and they can't reach behind them. And I remember at the time it just never occurred to me, because I haven't got any children. So you have to think about what they can do in terms of their body proportion. When we get into I think my 8-year-old now is starting, her head, it's really around that sort of size, soft time. You can see that they suddenly look like somebody just put them in a rack and stretched them. And their growth pattern changes dramatically, and they start to grow more distally. And then when they hit the teenage years, hands and feet really start to grow as well. So it sort of starts off with the growth head, trunk, until, I don't know what sort of age. Actually, you'll see from this weight, this is length, you can see here how suddenly this is over the first 3 years actually, but by the time they get into the teens, then they've started to get longer bodies, longer legs, longer arms, and their head, it's not shrinking, but everything else is growing at a different rate. And these are just, these growth charts have been criticised because they're very kind of European focused, so they're not as culturally relevant to different ethnic groups. But you can just see here, with the rapid, massive growth that children have. And this is the first year that, it's almost an exponential growth in that first year. And then it does start to slow down, which is good because it doesn't cost such a fortune to keep them in clothes. So it's all about proportions, and you've got a lot of internal development of bone development, changes in the way that joints are structured. So I don't know a lot of detail about this, but I do know that, there are certain areas of the body for children that are more prone to dislocation because the joints are much more shallow. For instance, the ulnar bone doesn't have a head on it until they're about 3 or 4. So it's called yank syndrome. When somebody yanks a child by their arm, they can really easily dislocate because it's just a straight end, and it's a really shallow joint. So joints are continuing to develop. Muscle bulk is developing. They're not built with all the muscle that they need, as you can tell when you see a baby. So they start to develop their muscles as well. And obviously, the development of the central nervous system is another lecture in itself. There's massive changes in the central nervous system these early years. So the other aspect of development then is actually about the development and reaching motor milestones. And this has come from predominantly, there are 2 people. There was a lady called McGraw who did a series of experiments and observations. She had these 2, they were twins. One was born with, I think, cerebral palsy, and the other one wasn't. And she gave one intensive physiotherapy and one not, and they videoed them. You can find it all online, actually. It's long, documentaries about the different developments and what they did. Some of it wasn't particularly ethical, I think, so I tend not to show it. But and Arnold Gessel was another one. So neuromaturationist theory is the idea that motor development occurs simply because of the development and the maturation of the central nervous system. And we now know that that's not accurate. But I was surprised at how much this work influenced the way that we think about motor development. So even the idea of motor milestones comes from this early work. And Gessel was around in the 1930s. So you talk about the development of gross motor skills. You'll hear these words used by occupational therapists as well. So gross motor skills. Do you know what gross motor skills are now? Give me an example of a gross motor skill.
One.
Yeah? Yeah. Anything else? jumping, yeah. So it's those things that don't require very small, fine movements. So when we talk about fine motor skills, what kind of things that we're tending to think about with fine motor skills? Yeah. The fine motor, a lot of it is about hand function. Yeah. So we sort of develop, and they develop alongside each other, but we develop our gross motor skills first, and then we start to refine them. So we'll watch this. This is only a 5-minute video. It's from the 1930s, so it's quite cute. But it just shows you some of his ideas. So you can see, it's quite... You see the change in development of the grasping and the ability of that child, just even over a small period of time. The whole film's about an hour long, and you can access it on YouTube if you feel like watching it, but it's quite interesting. So that, as I said, that was quite he was an influential theorist, really, in terms of how we understand motor development. But we have changed our view. So we've kept some of the ideas about the sort of stage-like process of development, but we've recognised that other aspects are influential. And then on the references for this is a link to an online book, well, it's a chapter all about this model. So you can access that and it will tell you much more about it. I'm just going to introduce it because it kind of then expands onto lifelong learning, and I haven't really got time to talk about that. But Gallagher's hourglass model is a lifelong approach to motor development. And so it's phase-like, so he talks about phases, and he has kind of time periods that roughly when this will occur, but it does allow for the differences that you might see. So he thinks the first phase really is about this reflexive movement phase, and talks about, if you think about it, it's the child learning to take information from the environment. Yeah? And when we come on to kind of some of the reflexes, a lot of the primitive reflexes are about sort of bringing information into the child, into the system. And then earlier in life, kind of slightly later part of the phase, which is 4 months to 1 year, is sort of a decoding stage. So they're now starting to process and make sense of the information that they're getting from the environment. It then talks about the next stage, rudimentary movement phases. So, and really this is about learning to sort of integrate some of those reflexive movements. And we talk about reflexes in different ways, but at this point the reflexes are often they're sort of around postural control. So many of the reflexes are about how do you maintain an upright position. If you're lying down, how do you move from lying to sitting? How to start weight bearing through your feet and crawling. Some of those early patterns of movement are influenced by reflexes. And so what the child's learning to do at this point is start to inhibit and integrate those reflexes into their movements. So if you're successful at sort of overcoming and inhibiting the grasp reflex, so the grasp reflex with a child is, I remember seeing, I think it was Michael McIntyre saying that you could use children as clothes pegs because they're babies because their grip is so strong. You just hang them on them with the washing and they'll just hold on to it. But if you've ever been grasped by a small baby and you can't get your finger out because they're just so tight. So that grasp reflex. So obviously the grasp reflex is useful, if you're going to bring things to your mouth and eat, but you need to be able to let go. And so they need to be able to inhibit the grasp reflex in order to make that into a useful, successful and controlled movement. So that's what this rudimentary movement phase is about. It's about learning to control movement and inhibit reflexes. So the next stage, the fundamental movement phase, is about things like, they started walking, so it's walking, it's running, it's stepping. As they get slightly older, it's about learning to catch and throw a ball. And what Gallagher thinks is that The reflexive movement stage is pretty fixed. A lot of that is about development and maturation of the system. But as you start to move into fundamental movement phase, some of those fundamental movements occur because, or the learning and development occurs because of the opportunities the children have. So you can't assume, like throwing a ball and catching a ball is a classic example, you can't assume that a child is going to be able to have ball skills if you never expose them to throwing and catching when they're in that age. And what he kind of says is that actually if you don't develop those skills at that point, it makes it much harder then to develop them later on. So we know that the kind of education, the school system, PE and all those sorts of things are really important in developing these fundamental movement skills. Does that make sense? And other things, some of the things, like running up and down the stairs and hopping and skipping. But again, they are sort of open to exposure. So a child never sees another child skip and doesn't know about skipping, then maybe they don't develop their skipping skills. And a lot of the kind of early years classes that kids go to and dance and movement, their curriculum, and certainly things like the Royal Dance Academy, now ballet, their early programs are all about enabling children to develop these fundamental movement skills. So to give them the opportunity to do that. So later on, 7 to 10, he's got different phases as well, but 7 to 14, you really start to specialise here. And the other aspect of the model is saying that, you might have a child who's extremely good at gymnastics, and so they go from 4, and all the way through, they're really working on their gymnastics. And so they have highly specialised movement skills in terms of balance, flexibility, back flips, and whatever it is they're doing. But they still need opportunities to develop their fine motor skills. So you can't assume that some of these other things are just going to develop. So specialisation too early can be detrimental to the child because it may mean that they don't develop other important skills. So it's important that children don't specialise at too early a stage. And teaching things at the right point. So I know that, for instance, there's been a change in thinking about swimming lessons and teaching children, and they understand now that children about the age of 7, 8 is the optimal time to start teaching children the different strokes of swimming, because that's when they have the capacity and the ability to actually start to learn those and implement them. It doesn't mean that some don't earlier on, but it's all about at what point are they actually able to develop sufficient buoyancy and those sorts of things. So it's kind of changed the way we think about lots of aspects of child development in terms of motor skills. So, once we've developed, then maintenance of those skills depends on how often you use them, what's the requirement of the environment that you're in, and it supports lifelong learning. Gallagher would say that you can continue to develop your motor skills at any age, but obviously the majority of the groundwork is done during childhood.
So top of the hourglass is that
adulthood.
It's like maintenance.
Yeah. So the top kind of view is viewed as adulthood, and it talks about sand. The sand is the stuff of life that you put in. Some of it is the environment, some of it is your sort of experiences, and those things can contribute to maintaining your motor skills. Yeah. And I suppose it can't, if you don't use something, you will eventually lose it. You might not lose it completely, but from yourself, if you learn to play an instrument as a child and you don't touch it for 10, 15 years, you're still better than someone who's never learned it, but you've lost a lot of those sort of, it's not just about knowledge, is it? It's about some of those motor skills as well. What are the movement phases? So the reflex movement phase in the early years, so we're talking about early months, the primitive reflexes are present at birth. And these are often protective. They're about seeking nourishment, and they're about gathering information. Yeah? And then from about 4 months onwards, you start to see these other emerging, which are the postural reflexes. And the postural reflexes are about trying to maintain stability, preparing for movement, for walking and crawling, and more fine manipulation. So in the rudimentary movement phase, we've got things like sitting and standing, crawling and creeping, balance, reaching, and gross grasp. So this is, I can't read mine. It's so small. The rudimentary phase, up to 2, isn't it? So like 1 to 2, yeah. Fundamental movement then is about maintaining your stability, more complex manipulation. So thinking about writing, for instance, gripping a pen, pen control, standing on one leg, because we all need to do that, and increase running, walking up and down. To start off with, children might have difficulty walking up and down stairs. If you think about the way people go up and down stairs, it's 1 foot after the other. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's alternate feet, and you notice when they first learn how to do it, then they kind of take 1 step, both feet up, and then it's a very sort of clumsy way of doing it. And gradually, they can do 1 foot after the other, and ultimately they can then run up and down the stairs. So it's that kind of increasing complexity of movement. And specialised movements, often this relates to sports, so rapid hand-eye coordination, or you might be thinking about, someone's learned, they're at the grade 4 or 5 at the piano, or, this is where they're taking up netball at school, or they might be competing and trampolining or something like that, or playing football, whatever they are. So increasingly specialised movements. So it's one of the things that all the way through my OT career, every now and then I've been required to know what the reflexes are for children, and having never worked with peds, it's one of the things I really struggle to keep in my head. So I'm introducing them to you here, and you will at some point be asked about reflexes. So it's a good thing to have a sense of some of the key ones. So these are the sort of protective, nourishing, information seeking. So the rooting reflex. So if you tickle a newborn baby's face, they turn their head and try to suck. So that's the rooting reflex. Or if you put anything around their mouth, they just start to try and grab it, don't they, with their lips and kind of suck. So that's your basic rooting reflex. The grasp reflex. Sucking is a reflexive movement that they're obviously born with, but they haven't got that at birth. But, without intervention, they would die because they can't eat. So the sucking reflex. This one here, I don't know what that's called now. Might be one of the labyrinth sign reflexes, where you tip the head back and they go into extension. So it's sort of an extensive extension reflex.
What's that for?
I've forgotten what it's called now. I think it's the labyrinthine reflex. I've got it written down. And it's a kind of, the labyrinthine reflexes are all starting to build up towards postural control. So they move towards what's called the writing and equilibrium mechanism. So your writing mechanisms are to do with your vestibular system, and they are attempts to keep your head upright in space no matter what's happening to you. Yeah? So, I don't know. I mean, it's very subtle. You've got it there all of the time. When you go to move from one position to the next, and you go from lying to sitting, your head will be the first thing. You don't leave it behind, do you? Not usually, anyway. So normally your head is the first thing to move. And that's all part of this writing reactions. And they're important postural reactions. Startle reflex. Yeah, so that's that classic one. If you pretend to drop the baby, it's quite fun to do. And you do it to your own. Might not make you popular when you go and visit your friends and their new baby. Just testing their reflexes. And with this one, you turn their head, the baby will turn their body to follow. So they're trying to keep everything aligned. Stage 3 to 9, so this is the integration stage, and now you start to see the postural reflexes. So this is called the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. Also think about the lancing pose, or the archer. So it's if you turn the head, one arm goes out and the other one goes up. Yeah? And it's sort of thought to be in preparation for reaching. Yeah? So, because you need to look at where your hand's going. But obviously you need to integrate that. So if every time you turn your head to the left you do this, you're going to have difficulties doing things. So that reflex needs to be integrated for successful hand-eye coordination and movement. And the bottom one is the symmetrical tonic neck reflex. Can you see why I struggle remembering all of these? It's asymmetrical, it's symmetrical. So the symmetrical one is in preparation for crawling. Yeah. So sort of the idea, their legs put their head back, they sit back on their feet. They've got that which is something that's important in terms of getting up on your hands and knees to start crawling. And in the early stages, movement is all around the reflexes. Yeah, so it's all about what's sort of done to them. It's association with different stimuli. As they start to develop, they can start to then act outside of the reflex movement. So this is where you reach a stage where you can't leave them on their back in the middle of the floor anymore, because when you come back they've moved. Yeah? So they're now able to sort of roll onto their front, or they might be able to stop wriggling around. So you start to see rolling, supported sitting, moving to less supported sitting. You might see them pulling themselves up into standing and crawling, and you start to see them grasping, releasing, and hand-to-hand movements, hand to mouth, a lot of hand to mouth. Okay. So stage 3, becoming increasingly sophisticated, so more mature writing and equilibrium reaction. So your equilibrium reaction, if writing reaction is trying to keep your head upright, equilibrium reaction does the same sort of thing, but it involves more of the whole body. So it's when you push somebody to one side, it's their ability to kind of regain their balance. Yeah? Sometimes it might just be, trying to maintain your balance on the bus, if the bus is moving around. I can remember, it was terrible. I had, it was when Esther was only about, she must have been almost a year, and she was sitting on a footstool in front of the TV, just sitting there, and she was only about this far away, and I thought, she's far too close to the television. So, as a caring mother, I decided to pull the footstool and move her away from the TV. Any ideas what happened? Yes. Because she didn't have the sort of, in that response, the surprise of the movie. I didn't whisk it, I just moved it. But she didn't have the writing and equilibrium reactions to maintain her space, so she just went head first off the footstool. Live and learn. So they're trying to develop postural control. And as OTs, we talk a lot about postural control, and it is the ability to maintain a given posture, whether it's upright or sitting. Lying is a bit easier, it doesn't require quite as much energy and skill to maintain your posture when lying. But obviously, if you can't maintain an upright posture when you're sitting, then you can't use your hands effectively. So it's an important basis of movement. So they're starting to move in space and increasing sense of stability, and you'll see the kind of increasing in their speed and their ability to kind of stop and start and turn and do all of those things. Year 1 to 3 now, they can walk forwards and they can walk backwards. Coordination of two sides together, so that integration of both sides of the body. So about crossing the midline, so it's the ability to reach with one hand across to the other, not just using them here, but actually, starting to turn and then using both hands together. So they can do things that need the use of both hands and feet. They can use them together, they can use them reciprocally, so alternatively, and in a cooperative manner. So if you think about catching the ball or kicking the ball. And at about the age of 3, you start to see the development of preference for handedness. So that can be an early indicator of something like developmental coordination disorder when children don't express a preference for handedness. They constantly flip, from one hand to the other. It's very easy to see if you put a range of pens or pencils or whatever out, whichever one they keep reaching for to grab and to use. So alternate feet on the stairs, starting to do more sophisticated things like forward rolls, drawing improves. They can start to use scissors, so that kind of complexity. Increasing balance and agility. So now they might be doing more sort of skipping. We've got balance, on the balance beam in gymnastics. Increasing handwriting and fine motor skills. Kind of start to get into a bit of, it might be threading or making things or whatever it is that they want to do, what they're interested in. Okay. So those are the key kind of developmental milestones that we still look for. And I think the important things to take away are that there's variability in those milestones, but they're relatively predictable, but there's some variability in how people move through them. A common one is some people never crawl, they don't learn to crawl, they just go straight from rolling and sitting into walking. Anybody come across that? I've known a few friends whose kids have done that. So, they might miss out odd stages. And I think the kind of classic thing about the environment is that I noticed that we have wooden and laminate floors in my house, and my children never learnt to crawl properly. They did what we call the laminate crawl. So the laminate crawl was 2 hands, 1 leg tucked underneath, and 1 foot. So they slid, so they pull themselves on their hands and they slide along. Because try crawling on laminate floor. It's really, really hard. You can't kind of get enough of a grip. And both children independently problem solve that, even though you've seen it as well. So if they don't have carpet to learn to crawl on, they sort of do this weird shuffle. And that's sort of problem solving about the way that the environment is starting to influence what they're doing. So the environment is key. Children do need help to develop through the stages sometimes. And if they have a difficulty like cerebral palsy or they might have DCD, then they need more support to effectively move through those phases. And that's kind of where we come in as occupational therapists when we work with children. So we might be looking at what are the opportunities that this child has, how can we match the occupation with the child's skills in a way that gives them the just right challenge so that they can develop the skills that they need. And OTs do lots of stuff with handwriting, which is a classic example. Often children will just assume that they'll just have the correct grip, and that they progress through these stages of having sort of a fist grip and then gradually progress to a nice, neat tripod grip. And lots of children, for various reasons, don't do that. And then an OT may come in and look at, actually, it affects their handwriting because it's more fatiguing. They might have problems with control, with sizing of the letters. And so an OT would think, well, actually, first of all, we need to develop that child's hand strength and musculature. Because if you're writing with a fist-like grip, you're not using intrinsic muscles of the hand. To move the pen, you're using the big muscles in the arm. That makes sense. So an OT would look at that and think, okay, let's do some hand strengthening exercises. Let's do coordination exercises to get the hand strong enough. Now we'll work on the pencil grip, and we'll think about, let's make that pencil larger so that the grip is less effortful. And then we'll think about how the child's actually structuring and forming letters. So an OT would have a very kind of graded approach to how they might support a child with their handwriting. Whereas outside of that, often they're just left to their own devices and they just sort of muddle through and end up with these strange grips and difficult writing of adults. So it doesn't always resolve. Sometimes people do need extra help to develop their motor skills. And that's really what the modern theories are telling us about motor development. Does anybody have any questions before we have a short break and then come back and think about motor control? Any questions?